Yeah, I thought she was good. I think we play differently when she's on the floor, and so again, learning how to play with her in the action. I thought she was good. I thought she didn't force anything. She played with great intention in everything that she did.
That is the sound of a shot being fired across the bow of the entire Women's National Basketball Association. That is Caitlin Clark, live on the microphone, issuing a direct, unvarnished warning to every single franchise that thought the Indiana Fever were just going to be a fun, run-and-gun sideshow this season. If you did not tune in to catch the preseason bloodbath between the Indiana Fever and the heavily favored New York Liberty, you missed what might go down as the most pivotal tone setter of the entire 2026 basketball calendar. Let us set the stage properly, because the context here is absolutely everything. Everybody and their mother has been penciling in the New York Liberty as the undisputed, undeniable 2026 WNBA champions. They are the super team. They have the pedigree. They have the depth. They have the star power that commands primetime television slots before a single basketball is even tipped off. The narrative was written. The Liberty were supposed to walk into this preseason matchup, stretch their legs, assert their dominance, and remind the up-and-coming Fever exactly who runs the yard. But that is not what happened. What happened was an absolute massacre. The Indiana Fever walked right into that gym, looked the reigning juggernauts dead in the eye, and completely ran them out of the building. This was not a fluke. This was not a lucky shooting night. This was a 109-91 dismantling. It was a masterclass in pace, space, and pure, unfiltered aggression. And the most terrifying part of this entire reality check? The Indiana Fever did this without two of their most critical foundational pieces. Aaliyah Boston, the anchor of their interior, was sitting on the bench in street clothes as a precaution for a lower leg issue. Lexi Hull, their perimeter defensive engine, was held out due to a tight hamstring. Indiana was playing with a bruised deck, and they still absolutely folded the championship favorites. To truly understand the magnitude of this victory, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. We have to talk about the ghost of 2025. We have to talk about Caitlin Clark. If you followed the league last year, you know that the 2025 season was a nightmare scenario for Clark's physical health. It was the kind of year that tests not just a player's body, but their absolute sanity. She was basically eaten alive by her own physiology. First, it was the quad issues. Then, just as she started getting her burst back, the thigh flared up. Then the groin. Then the ankle. It was a cascading failure of a body that had been pushed beyond its limits under the brightest spotlight in the history of women's sports. One thing stacked on top of another until her season effectively flatlined. She managed to play only 13 games the entire year. When Caitlin Clark jogged onto that hardwood against the New York Liberty, she had not played a real high-stakes basketball game since July 15, 2025. That is not a short break. That is an eternity in basketball years. That is nearly a full trip around the sun, sitting in rehab facilities, doing band work, watching film, and wondering if your body is ever going to allow you to be the player you know you are. So yes, people were nervous. The entire Fever fan base was holding their collective breath. The question walking into this preseason tip-off wasn't really about winning or losing the game. It was much simpler and much more terrifying than that. Could she still move? Was the magic still there? Could she plant that foot and change direction without flinching? Now, Clark herself admitted she had nerves. She told reporters pre-game that she was incredibly excited to get back into the flow of things, but she openly copped to having butterflies. And honestly, how could she not? After a year where your body repeatedly betrays you, the mental weight is often heavier than the physical pain. The version of Clark that the Indiana Fever needs to win a championship isn't just a physically healthy Clark. It is a Clark who trusts her own anatomy. It is a Clark who isn't second-guessing her cuts. Oh, if you are a box score watcher, you might look at her stat line and panic. She finished the night shooting 2 for 10 from the field in 17 minutes of strictly managed playing time. On paper, that looks rough. It looks rusty. But if you actually watched the tape, if you understand the geometry of basketball, you saw exactly what the rest of the league is now terrified of. The numbers lied. Her first bucket of the 2026 campaign wasn't some crazy highlight reel logo three-pointer. It was much more important than that. Coming off a screen from the newly acquired Monique Billings, Clark slipped into the lane, effortlessly read the collapsing defense, and floated a perfectly touched shot off the glass for the game's first points. It was quiet. It was effortless. It was Clark doing what Clark does best, using her elite footwork, finishing softly, and making a highly complex read look like an absolute walk in the park. After everything she endured in 2025, that quiet little floater landed like a bombshell. It was the answer to the question everyone had been asking. Then came the three-pointer. She pulled up from deep, and it went in completely clean. Quick release, zero hesitation, no babying the ankle, no favoring the knee. Cautious optimism immediately transformed into actual, unbridled excitement. The Fever hung 32 points on the Liberty in the first quarter alone, and Clark's early buckets set the entire tone for that blistering run. But her scoring was only a fraction of the story. Clark's true genius in this game was her pacing. She mentioned post-game that the absolute last thing she wants to do is stand around and let the defense get comfortable. If she doesn't have the ball, she is sprinting down the floor, forcing the defense to cross-match and panic. This opens up the floor for everyone else. This philosophy was on full display with her budding chemistry with Monique Billings. Clark and Billings spent time together at USA Basketball, and that connection was instantly visible. Billings was sprinting to spots on the floor that Clark was already looking at before the Liberty defense could even rotate their heads. It was a psychic connection that produced 9 quick points for Billings, all off plays that started with Clark aggressively pushing the pace the literal second Indiana touched the basketball. Healthy, fast, making reads at light speed before defenders can set their feet. That is what this offense looks like when the engine is roaring. And post-game brackets, Clark confirmed the best news possible. Her body felt great, and she felt incredibly fast. But if Caitlin Clark's return was the headline, the absolute jaw-dropping, stop-the-presses story of the night belonged to Sophie Cunningham. Do not for 1 second forget what Cunningham has been through. An MCL tear is not a sprained ankle that you tape up tightly, pop a painkiller, and play through. It is brutal surgery. It is months of grueling, isolated rehab. It is the darkest side of professional sports. You are basically tasked with relearning how to trust a joint that completely gave out on you. Cunningham was having a fantastic 2025, playing 30 games and starting 13 before the injury violently ended everything. She didn't even get clearance to practice with her teammates until January 2026. She spent months watching from the sidelines, carrying the emotional burden of wanting to help but being physically caged. So when she checked into this preseason game against the projected champions, the stakes for her were astronomically higher than anyone else on that floor. Everyone else was out there trying to get some cardio and win a preseason exhibition. Sophie Cunningham was out there trying to prove to herself that her career wasn't altered forever. And my goodness, did she ever prove it? She played exactly 13 minutes. In those 13 minutes, she dropped 14 points. Let that efficiency sink in. But it wasn't just how many points she scored, it was how she scored them that makes this the craziest performance of the preseason. She didn't grind these points out with lucky bounces in the post, and she didn't inflate her stats at the free throw line. She hit 3 absolute daggers from three-point land. Think about the biomechanics of a jump shot. You have to catch the ball, violently plant your feet, absorb the shock in your knees, and explode upward while a world-class athlete is flying at your face to block the shot. Cunningham did this 3 times with zero hesitation. No extra gather step, no second guessing, nothing in her body language that screamed, "I'm still working my way back." She caught it, and she fired it with the supreme, unshakable confidence of a killer. And her physical conditioning? Off the charts. During training camp, teammates were already pointing out that she spent her year off in the weight room. Her shoulders, her arms, her core. She looked like a different athlete. She used that year of exile to fine-tune her body into a weapon. On the defensive end, she was an absolute menace. You cannot fake defensive intensity on a surgically repaired knee. You either trust it or you don't. Cunningham trusted it. She brought terrifying aggression, jumping into passing lanes, picking up 2 steals, contesting absolutely every shot in her airspace, and setting brick wall screens for Clark that genuinely hurt people. When she checked into the game, the Fever's entire rotation got visibly tighter. The pressure on the Liberty ball handlers got suffocatingly heavy. New York started making sloppy, uncharacteristic mistakes, entirely driven by the sheer will and physicality that Cunningham brought to the floor. It was this exact performance that prompted Caitlin Clark's viral post-game quote. Clark didn't soften her words. She didn't give a boring PR-trained answer. She looked at the reporters and explicitly stated that Cunningham is a player who rises to the occasion every single time. When their backs are against the wall, Cunningham has the loudest voice. She fights. She scraps. Every team in this league would probably kill to have a player like that, Clark said. That is the ultimate endorsement from your franchise superstar. That is the kind of chemistry that builds dynasties. But the merch masala of this game doesn't stop with the stars. The real reason the rest of the WNBA is losing sleep over this tape is the absolute defensive torture chamber orchestrated by Raven Johnson. If you read Raven Johnson's stat line from this game, you might think the scorekeeper made a typo. In roughly 17 minutes of action, Johnson recorded 6 points, 8 assists, 2 steals, and 3 blocks. Let me repeat that. A point guard recorded 3 blocks in 17 minutes. That is statistically absurd. If you watch the film, however, it makes complete terrifying sense. Johnson was an absolute beast on the defensive end. She pressured every single New York Liberty ball handler the second they crossed half court. She didn't give an inch of ground. She sat in the passing lanes like a predator waiting for a mistake. She consistently, flawlessly anticipated exactly where New York wanted to initiate their sets and completely blew them up before the play could even develop. This is the kind of disruptive, in-your-shirt point guard defense that turns a championship-level offense into a frantic, hyperventilating turnover machine. The 8 assists are almost a secondary story compared to her off-ball activity. But they highlight just how brilliant she was in transition. She was the tip of the spear. And let's talk about the results of that defensive pressure. The New York Liberty, the super team, the veteran squad, the projected champions, turned the ball over a staggering 24 times. 24 turnovers in a 40-minute basketball game is a catastrophic failure of execution. But it wasn't just unforced errors. It was Indiana forcing them into panic. And the Fever didn't just force turnovers, they capitalized on them with ruthless efficiency. Indiana scored 29 points directly off those 24 Liberty mistakes. Every single time New York got sloppy, the Fever were already flying the other way before the defense could even recognize they had lost the ball. Indiana outscored New York 20-10 in fast break points. And that 10-point gap wasn't the result of one lucky run in the second quarter. It was the result of a sustained, relentless 40-minute track meet. Every loose ball, every made basket, every stolen pass instantly turned into a dead sprint. New York's rotation, as deep as it is supposed to be, simply could not match the cardiovascular demand of playing at that pace. By the second half, Liberty players who normally look completely comfortable in their half-court sets were getting caught flat-footed in mid-rotation, sucking wind, with nowhere to go because Indiana was already putting the ball in the hoop. We also need to address the absolute sheer firepower of the Indiana bench and supporting cast. Against a team that is supposed to field the deepest roster in the history of the league, the Fever had 5 different players finish in double-digit scoring. Kelsey Mitchell, the veteran bucket getter, put on an absolute clinic, dropping 18 points and stretching the floor with lethal accuracy. Walker Kimbrough matched her entirely, also pouring in 18 points from multiple spots on the floor, proving that she is going to be an offensive nightmare for opposing second units. Then there is Michaela Timpson. With Aaliyah Boston out, the Fever needed someone to anchor the paint, take the physical punishment down low, and finish through contact. Timpson answered the call brilliantly, scoring 11 tough, gritty points in the interior. Her ability to hold her ground against New York's massive front court proves that coach Stephanie White has incredibly versatile options when Boston returns. Timpson is developing into a legitimate scoring presence inside, and that adds a completely new dimension to an already lethal offense. And we cannot overlook the strategic brilliance of Justine Patad. She added 8 points, but her true value was in the geometry she created on the floor. Patad is 6'4", but she has legitimate three-point range. All night long, she kept pulling her defender out to the three-point line. This sounds like a simple basketball concept until you realize the cascading effect it has on a defense. New York desperately wanted to collapse the paint and double-team Cunningham or close driving lanes for Clark. But you cannot leave a 6'4" sharpshooter wide open on the perimeter. Patad forced the Liberty into impossible coverage decisions. Her mere presence on the floor is not a novelty. It is a highly advanced spacing weapon that breaks defensive schemes. As the second half dragged on, the reality of the situation set in. The Liberty's bench rotation looked visibly thinner, slower, and exhausted. Indiana, meanwhile, just kept stepping on the gas. The final score of 109-91 actually feels generous to New York. It was an 18-point blowout that didn't even feel that close in the final 10 minutes. New York's starters couldn't slow the fever down, and their bench was completely overwhelmed by the sheer energy of Indiana's second unit. Yes, the skeptics will say it is just a preseason game. You can try to brush it off. You can say the Liberty weren't showing their full playbook. But that is pure denial. Indiana beat a Liberty team that is genuinely loaded with all-world talent. They did it without their franchise center in Boston and a key defensive piece in Hull. They did it by executing a high-pace, high-pressure system for a full 40 minutes without a single lapse in concentration. That is not a preseason mirage. That is a basketball team that knows exactly what its identity is, knows exactly how to execute it, and has the personnel to drown you if you cannot keep up. The entire construction of the 2026 Indiana Fever roster is predicated on Caitlin Clark being healthy and the team playing at warp speed. This game provided the first irrefutable, high-definition evidence that the painful offseason paid off. Clark's body is no longer a liability. It is her weapon again. The players surrounding her are completely bought into the system. They are ready to run until the opposing team's lungs burn. The fact that Clark had a terrible shooting night, 2 for 10, and the Fever still won by 18 points against the title favorites, is the most chilling takeaway from this entire game. It proves that the system does not collapse if Clark isn't carrying a heroic scoring load. The depth is real. The defense is real. Think about the sheer impossibility of defending this complete roster. You have Raven Johnson picking your point guard's pocket and dealing out 8 assists. You have Timpson bullying you for 11 points in the paint. You have Patad dragging your rim protector out to the three-point line. You have Mitchell and Walker Kimbrough dropping 18 points each off the bench. You have Billings running flawless transition lanes. You have Sophie Cunningham back from the brink of a career-altering injury, dropping 14 points in 13 minutes and knocking down threes with cold-blooded precision, and pulling all the strings, operating at a mental processing speed that few in the history of the game possess, is a fully healthy, incredibly angry Caitlin Clark. The New York Liberty will likely still lead the predictions on ESPN and in the sportsbooks. That is completely fine. In fact, that is exactly what the Indiana Fever want. This group has historically played their sharpest, most violent basketball when they are the ones with a massive chip on their shoulder. They thrive on the disrespect. When the pressure is external, when the media expects them to fail, Indiana tends to run harder, hit harder, and compete significantly longer than anyone else. A New York Liberty team that has been practically handed the 2026 championship trophy before a single regular season minute has been played might suddenly find that motivation gap to be a fatal flaw. The WNBA is officially on notice. The Indiana Fever are not a cute story about a young team growing together. They are not a marketing gimmick. They are a deeply constructed, highly motivated, terrifyingly fast basketball team with a superstar who has regained her physical powers and a supporting cast that is ready to go to war. They have stared down the projected champions and utterly humiliated them. The warning shot has been fired. The 2026 season has officially begun, and it belongs to the Indiana Fever.